Good afternoon and welcome to ninth grade biology. Today we will be discussing two-trait Punnett squares and following a lecture on one-trait Punnett squares. Below you can see that the lesson objectives are that students will be able to complete a two-trait Punnett square as well as be able to create a heterozygous Punnett square based on their biological family or based on a biological family that they know of. Here are some teacher notes that could be helpful if a substitute was teaching the lesson, and these lesson notes would also be very helpful in letting the teacher or in a substitute knowing what to do on each slide. On this slide, this is the do now, so that as students come into the class, they will be able to review the concepts learned yesterday in class and ensure lesson readiness for the next day. Previously, we talked about how to complete a one-trait Punnett square like this one, resulting in genetic diversity. At this point, I would ask students to check their work by going to this next slide and making sure that they have the correct answers. Previously, we've discussed how genotype and phenotype are two different things. So at this point, I would ask one student to re-explain what phenotype and genotype are in the context of this Punnett square. The student would likely say that genotype describes the alleles that each individual has, and each individual has the potential of passing on to their own offspring, whereas a phenotype describes how each individual appears. So these individuals would appear yellow, and these individuals would appear green. Yellow is the dominant trait, green is the recessive trait. However, these yellow individuals would be able to pass on a green allele to any offspring because it is part of their genotype. At this point, I would ask students to match the phenotype with the genotype. They would do this first at their seats, and then after they have, I'm satisfied that enough of the students are on track, I would have one student come to the smartboard and complete this activity. Hopefully the student would recognize that the little y's each stand for green, and they're both recessive, so it would apply to the green pea plant, while the capital Y stands for the dominant yellow trait and masks this green recessive trait. Then they can check their answer, and they're correct. As you'll remember, the alleles of genes have two sources of genetic variation: independent assortment and crossing over. Because of these two sources, inheritance of two different traits, say hair color and eye color, can vary from individual to individual. Today, we're going to learn how to demonstrate this variation with two-trait Punnett squares. So, our first Punnett square that we're going to do as a class will involve this cross here. The R's stand for the shape of the individual, and the Y's stand for the color, as we described previously. The capital R stands for a round P, and the lowercase r stands for a wrinkled P. So, to complete this cross, first you're going to distribute all combinations of one parent across the top. So you're going to take the capital R with the capital Y and put that here. The capital R with the lowercase y, put that here. Lowercase r with the capital Y goes here. And the lowercase r and the lowercase y go here. Because this is a self-pollination type of cross, the same gamete combinations will be going down this side. However, if this was a two-trait Punnett square cross for mammals, where it's very easy to tell the gender, As you'll remember, by convention, the father's gamete combinations go across the top and the mother's gamete combinations go down the side. Next, we're going to fill in this table by taking the gametes from both the father and from the mother into each box. We would take the capital R from here, bring it here, capital R from here, goes here. Same with the Y's. Then I would have students fill in the rest of this Punnett square at their seats before we check the answers. I would go each line by each line and ask students if they got it. If they did not get it, we would review the concept until they feel that they understand it. I'd give them a chance to correct their answers, and then we'd move on to the next row. I'd perform the same check before we move on to the next row, and then hopefully by the last row, giving them this opportunity to check their answers as we go, they will have completed the right answers for the last row. At this point, I would, even though we've already explained phenotype versus genotype in the class period, I would want one student to re-explain this difference so that I could be 100% positive that the students understand the difference before we move on. I'd reiterate that the yellow and round traits, capital Y and capital R, are dominant to the green and wrinkled traits, lowercase y and lowercase r. And another student would be asked to identify which seeds will be green or yellow and which will be wrinkled and round based on all of these different genotypes. So at this point, this is another check to see whether they understand genotype versus phenotype now that we've added on a complex second gene working with a different gene. So at this point, students are going to be asked to choose their own groups of 2 to 3 individuals to work on guided practice problems. Throughout the guided and independent practice sets, students who will require it for their differentiation will be checking off each task on a checklist provided as a formative assessment. As they're dividing themselves into groups, I'll put this following image up on the PowerPoint or Smartboard screen to help the students with the first group task. So their first group task is to determine what the phenotypic ratios are from the Punnett square that they have previously done. So this chart just kind of visually gives them a good example of what phenotype versus genotype is. I would explain for the first two that this is a round and yellow pea plant because there's at least one capital R and at least one capital Y in its genotype. Then I would explain that this pea is round and green, and we know that that's its phenotype. Now its genotype, I would then explain, is one capital R and then either an R capitalized or an R lowercased. And then we know that the next two alleles are little y and little y because green is the recessive color allele, so we know that both of those alleles are lowercase y. I would then ask students to explain what the genotype versus what the phenotype is for the wrinkled yellow pea and the wrinkled green pea. They would likely reply that this is a lowercase r, capital Y, and then either capital or lowercase y. And the next student that would explain this type of pea would explain that this is lowercase r, lowercase g. At this point, I would ask the students to determine what the phenotypic ratios are of the Punnett square that we have previously talked about. So this is the Punnett square that we're speaking of. I would leave this picture up on the board, but they would have access to the Punnett square so that they could determine it. They're likely going to determine that the answer is 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. Most groups of students should be able to get this because we've discussed this on a smaller scale in the last class dealing with single trait Punnett squares. So at this point, I would ask students to complete this example, which would test how much they really understand phenotype versus genotype. So they would click on one and then have to guess. Now, before I pick one, all three of these are actually correct. So if they pick one of the other two, it will also be correct. And I can ask a variety of students to come to the board since there are 16 different opportunities for them to get the answer right. So we can do this for a while until I make sure that each student really understands this concept. Then I would put this Punnett square back up on the board and ask one student to come out and say what the phenotypic ratio is, 9:3 to 3:1, and then we would move on to this activity, which asks students to determine what number of green or wrinkled or yellow or round peas there are. And this activity uses A's and B's just to distinguish between, there's two number threes, so you have two different threes in two different answers here. So the letters mean nothing more than that. So first I'd basically just ask a different student to come to the board and answer each one of these. So the number of green and wrinkled pea pods, we draw the distinction that green and wrinkled are both the recessive traits, and so this is 1 from the 9:3 to 3:1 ratio. The number of yellow and round pea pods, so this is a dominant and a dominant trait. So we've got 9 here. So that's the 9 from the 9:3 to 3:1. Now we're going to look for the 2 threes. So we're looking for one dominant and one recessive trait. So we've got a recessive and a dominant trait here. So 3B, here we go. And we've got a dominant trait and a recessive trait. So we've got this 3 right here. Oh. And again, I would not be guiding this, it would be students guiding this. Now we're going into the ratios for color, for one trait to one trait. So these ratios are going to be 12:4, which is the same as 3:1 if you do some math. So the number of wrinkled pea pods, wrinkled is a recessive trait, so you're going to have 4 of those. Green pea pods, green is the other recessive trait, so you're going to have 4 of those. The number of yellow pea pods, that is a dominant trait, so you're going to have 12. This is also a dominant trait, so you're going to have 12. Students will be asked to complete the following Punnett square example of a doubly heterozygous parent and a homozygous recessive parent. This will be done in group practice. Then students will be able to check their work. Individual students will be able to come to the board and remove the shade on each. Because the answers are all the same in each column, students will check their answers by column and be given a chance in between each column to correct misconceptions that they had. Then students will be able to answer this Punnett square on their own as closure. One group of students will be able to complete the following blank 2-trait Punnett square on the board, and another group will come up with the phenotypic ratio after each student has completed it on their own at their seats. Then I will ask if anyone has any questions. Then students will be asked to complete this exit slip and complete this homework.